conversation. But it's just great to be here this evening to talk about Rory's wonderful book, When It Is Darkest. I have just finished it and I've got wee tabs all the way through it. So I'm going to just begin by asking you, Rory, right, tell us about this book. It's not the first book you've written, so why did you write it, and what's the story, and why would anybody start writing a book in a pandemic, I suppose? Worst possible time.
Well, before I get answer the question, so thanks to Siobhan and to Vic for organising tonight's event. I'm delighted to be here. Siobhan and I have known each other for many years, and Siobhan likes to tell this story, which is when I was at a postgraduate student, a PhD student in Queen's in Belfast. Siobhan, obviously, who's younger than me, was an undergraduate, not a lot. It was an undergraduate student, and I was a demonstrator. So that's when Siobhan and I first met. So that's just a few years ago. So, and obviously, we've obviously tracked each other's careers since. So it's a delight, absolute delight to with Siobhan here today. In particular, now, obviously, Siobhan, not only does you doing amazing work in suicide prevention, but also a really important role in terms of being the interim mental health champion for Northern Ireland. So I know that's a challenging role. So certainly, in my point of view, I think it's a huge admiration for that. So with that sort of introduction, yeah, it's a good question. Why did I think about, or why did I want to write a book? I suppose I've been working in this field now for 25 years, and I always had in the back of my mind, I suppose, that I probably would try and write some book which is accessible to people who really don't read academic papers and to the wider population. And I suppose that sort of desire has sort of grown in me over the last few years, because I do a lot of public engagement work as it is. And I think that some of the most rewarding aspects of the work that I do is meeting people who obviously are influenced or affected by our research, hopefully in a positive way, if our research has helped them understand better either how they feel or how a loved one feels, or sadly to try and make sense of the devastation of suicide. And so in terms of that, it's been sort of percolating in my head for a few years, but probably more recently in the last 3 or 4 years. But what had stopped me was I couldn't really think of a way forward in terms of, I didn't want to just write another book on suicide, because there's lots of amazing books out there which cover all the risk factors and models and so on. And I suppose what I wanted to do was bring together my own personal experiences of working in the field for 25 years, share the stories of people I've met along the way, and use that as a way of sort of bringing together the personal and the professional. But I still couldn't quite work out how that would look. And so actually what happened in the end, and I talk about this in the introduction and in the epilogue of the book, was that in 2019, in the summer of 2019, I was on holiday with my family, and one night I couldn't sleep. And anyway, so I had this eureka moment of, I could see this moment of clarity. It seemed that I could see how I might do it, and I could think of some examples in my head of stories, of people's stories that really helped me coalesce and understand how I could tell their stories, as well as I wanted to share something about my own personal mental health and my own experience of being bereaved by suicide. And then so what I then did was, that night then I fell off to sleep, and then I wrote the first few hundred words of what turned out to be the book. Then the next day in Crete, in the sunshine in Crete. And then the bizarrest bit, or the most sort of coincidental bit, or I don't know how to describe it, was the summer holiday is the only time I properly turned off my email. And then so when I got back, literally the day I got back from holiday, I turned on my email and I was scrolling through the whatever backlog of emails. And there was one which I scrolled past initially because it's from a publisher. I just assumed it was a publisher wanting me to review a manuscript or a proposal. So anyway, I left it and then went back to it. And then this was the bizarre bit. It was this publishing director at Penguin Random House, and she said, I'm on maternity leave, and I'm just trying to think of some projects which I might be able to get might start when I come back from maternity leave, and I'm really keen to do something on suicide, and I think you'd be perfect for doing it. So I couldn't believe the coincidence, because she wanted to do one which was aimed at the general population, general public, to really tackle what we know is such a challenging and difficult area. So that's just, so then, as I say, the rest is history. I then worked closely with Sarah to put together a proposal, and then, and I wanted to obviously go through a mainstream publisher, so it all worked out brilliantly. And then signed a contract literally not long before, maybe the week before COVID took hold in whatever, March last year. And then obviously we were so overwhelmed with work for COVID-related mental health work in Glasgow here that I didn't get a chance really to do much in the book. So the book then was written from, I think, July through to December, but literally in earnest every night and every weekend. And yeah, so that's sort of the long story short of the book. So sorry, that was a long way of answering your question.
No, that's great. And I think you've really achieved, I mean, it's a lovely book to read. And I think it's a book that members of the public who don't have a background in even mental health or suicide prevention or academia will find it easy to read and easily digestible in that sense. But I suppose the other important point about the book is you don't shy away from the complexities of this, and you explain the science of it. And I think that's what's so important, and that's what differentiates this book from other books that might be out there, which, you know, emphasize and go into the personal stories or rely on the science completely. You know, and so this blends the two together. And you are considered a thought leader in the whole, you know, international expert. Absolutely, that's what you are. So you developed the theory of suicidal behavior, and you explain that very well in the book. Do you want to talk us through that? So this is the theory, really explaining why do people die by suicide?
Yeah, I suppose the book is really my culmination of thinking around suicide for 25 years. And one of the things, obviously, I say, I mean, because literally every day, more or less, for the last 25 years, in some shape or form, I've been focusing on suicide and thinking about suicide. And I suppose for those of you who haven't read the book or seen the book yet, the way I sort of structured in 4 parts. And then part 1 is sort of the who, the how, the when of suicide, trying to understand who's at risk. So, for example, we know that obviously 3/4 of all suicides in the UK are by men. We looked at then obviously the sort of international profiles and then talk. So there's a lot about just trying to, first of all, help people understand or get some context for suicide, especially if you haven't been directly affected. And then in part 2, I'm moving into this more understanding, and that's really, I suppose, where my model of suicide which forms the sort of backbone of the book. And really, so my model of suicide is called the integrated motivational volitional model of suicide, and it was my attempt. I published it first in 2011, and then I updated it with my colleague Olivia Kirtley. Sorry, in 2011, I said 2011, didn't, yeah. And then I updated it in 2018. And when I first put it up in 2011, it was my attempt to sort of synthesize and make sense of my understanding of the existing theories and sort of gaps in our understanding. And so although the model is in different phases, there's 3 phases within the model. In essence, what I try and do is try and convey that although the factors that lead to suicide are complex and many, and if we're to understand suicide risk, we have to look beyond mental illness explanations or mental health problems explanations, look at the social context and also the psychological and cultural context. And I suppose my argument is it draws a lot from work that Mark Williams had done before me, and Paul Gilbert, and a range of others. Thomas Joyner's work as well, obviously, was heavily influential. So basically, I argue is that suicidal thoughts emerge from feeling in which you feel unbearable pain, and that sense of unbearable pain, that sense of being trapped by mental pain, is driven by feelings of defeat and humiliation, which also can be triggered by feelings of rejection and loss and shame and so on. And I suppose one of the messages which is in the model, but also is throughout the book, is if we're to understand suicide and suicide risk, we need to understand that suicide is so often not about wanting to die, but wanting mental pain to end, being trapped by that mental pain. And then what I try to unpack in the model and in the book is what are the factors that can lead to that sense of mental pain. And we touch on early life trauma and sort of adverse childhood experiences and inequality, because remember, suicide ultimately is an incredible example of health inequality, which is, I mean, it's an utter disgrace that we live in Western countries, that you have huge disparities, like 3 or 4 times at least, people differential in suicides and people who live in the most affluent areas compared to those who live in the most deprived areas. And it's not even just the health inequality, but it's basically that suicide can affect any one of us. And I suppose we all have a sort of responsibility to try and think about what we all can do, hopefully to put pressure on political leaders and governments and so on, to ensure that suicide prevention is prioritized, but also to ensure that we live in a world that we recognize that we all can do something to help in terms of preventing suicide. Now, getting back to your point about the model, so although you've got this sense of entrapment, this trapped by mental pain, which is driven by defeat and humiliation often, so the argument is that leads you to be an individual to become suicidal. And what then the model I tried to do with the model was differentiates between factors that lead you to feel suicidal in the first place, and then understand what we describe as a transition from thoughts to action, or from thoughts to acts, to understand why it is we think it's about 1/3 of people who think about suicide cross that precipice from thinking to acting on their thoughts of suicide. So in terms, I mentioned that my model was in 3 parts, and that third part of the model is really trying to understand the transition from thinking to acting. And so there's a whole chapter in part 2 on crossing the precipice. And what I try to talk about there are the factors that increase the likelihood that somebody will act on their thoughts. And they're called, in my model's terms, they're called volitional factors, or volitional moderators. And I suppose what my model has done is one of a group of what we talk about in the field of ideation to action framework models. And that's really recognizing that the factors that lead somebody to becoming suicidal in the first place are often different from the factors that lead somebody to act on their thoughts. And the reason that's important is because that would suggest then that there are different ways or different places or steps in which you can intervene. So part of it could be about you trying to understand why it is somebody becomes suicidal. But then if you're trying to then understand what can I do to reduce the likelihood that somebody acts on their thoughts of suicide, the volitional phase is really important. Now, the last thing, and I'll sort of come back to you, Siobhan, to your question, is it's really important to highlight that although I'm saying that we're trying to prevent suicide, and the sad reality is many people on this call, like myself, have been bereaved by suicide. And the stark reality is that our ability to predict who will die by suicide is still sadly no better than chance. And I suppose what I try to do with the model is trying to improve our understanding. So if I can improve our understanding, we can then hopefully tailor treatments or interventions to hopefully prevent more suicides than we currently do. But it's this idea that although suicide is preventable up until the very last moment, it is devastatingly difficult to prevent at an individual level. So I suppose that's directly to people who've lost somebody to suicide. Is one of the most common reasons I talk about this using people I've met in the book, is the guilt, the pain that bereavement causes, and all those questions about what I should have done differently. And it's a natural reaction to feel that sort of sense of blame and guilt. And I suppose my message, and I say this a few times in the book, is the death of somebody else can never be the fault of explained by one individual. So it's not about us. I question myself in the deaths that have been close to me still daily about what I could have done differently, even though I know that sadly I couldn't. In those cases, I wasn't able to prevent the deaths. So please, if you are bereaved, it's not your fault. And what we're trying to then think about, all of us, is what can we do to help support ourselves, people who are bereaved, and maybe then if we can help ourselves, we can hopefully prevent devastation in others moving forward. That was a lot again in one go.
Oh, that was brilliant, Rory. And I think that's a really, really important message, because, you know, sometimes when we say suicide is preventable, that is just a heartbreaking message for people who've lost loved ones to suicide. And it's not saying that anybody else is to blame for that person's death, you know, they die by their own hand, but also referring to the many things that we can do to reduce the levels of pain and distress across society, which will impact on those suicidal thoughts. And then when people do express suicidal thoughts or whenever they're in a crisis, there's lots we can do there to help them. And I think the model is really beneficial because it gives us information about all those universal interventions that are going to act on the suicidal thoughts. And also then it provides pointers or signposts for the types of treatments and interventions that might work whenever we have people in front of us who are feeling suicidal. So do you want to talk a wee bit more about that side of it? So when someone is suicidal, you know, what do we do? What should we do then if we know that someone's in suicidal distress or despair?
Well, I will answer that, but just something struck me when you're speaking there, Siobhan. Something else I try and do in the book is dispel myths around suicide, and that relates to, I think, what we may do if we're concerned about somebody who's suicidal. And I suppose one of them really important, I think I covered 14 myths around suicide, and one of them, I think one of the most important is the fact that when I started out in the field in the 1990s, it really was a case that you were frightened to even mention the word suicide or ask somebody whether they're suicidal, because the fear was that you plant the idea in their head. And although that myth still persists, I think it has been broken down somewhat. But the reality is asking somebody whether they're suicidal. So if you are concerned about somebody, I would say ask directly, because ask directly could start a life-saving conversation. So I'm not saying that's how suicide prevention is just about asking somebody whether they're suicidal, but it's part of it, trying to open up that conversation. Because a number of people, I suppose I've met over the years who have obviously been frightened about asking that question, but then have had the courage to ask it. And they're so grateful that they did, because there's so many cases in which they were able to get help and support. And similarly, though, if you're somebody who is experiencing suicidal thoughts, I just know that, it's the most difficult thing to do for many to admit that you're feeling suicidal. And so certainly over my years of experience is that the number of people who, when somebody did ask them, are you thinking of ending your life? This sense of relief, because actually somebody had noticed that maybe they weren't feeling well, or that actually they were worth somebody asking that question. Because remember, when that acute suicidal state, the individual often feels that they're a burden on others, a sense of worthlessness, and that things will never end. And again, I talk about stories in people's lives in the book about who've asked that question, or even just asked that question, and then they may even have asked it in a clumsy way, but the person just felt that actually there was a sense of connection. And then the kid, one of the people I talk about in the book, then the next day he went to his GP, and then his GP got him counseling support, and then that was part of his start of his journey of recovery. So I suppose, in terms of, if you're concerned about something, please ask directly. But remember, it's always a case, if you're concerned that you can't keep somebody safe, or if you are suicidal yourself and you feel you can't keep yourself safe, please reach out, contact your GP, a mental health professional, or if all else, contact the emergency services, phone 999 111, the helpline in Northern Ireland, Samaritans. Please reach out for help, because they're really important. Another myth, though, I suppose, is that suicidal thoughts are not permanent. And we know from all the research that they come in waves of intensity. And I suppose what we're trying to do is, when somebody's in that heightened wave of really feeling acutely suicidal, thinking this is never going to change, this is never going to end, well, then that's when arguably are most vulnerable. And so please reach out. Or one of the other things I talk about in part 4 of the book, or part 3 of the book, and part 4 is interventions and supports. And in part 3, I try to sort of talk about the evidence for psychological treatments to help people who are feeling suicidal, but I also have a whole chapter on safety planning. And I suppose what safety planning is building on work of colleagues Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown in the United States developed originally. And it's a way in which helping somebody think about, there's 6 steps to us trying to identify the warning signs that maybe a crisis is escalating. And then a way of thinking about internal and external distractions, people and places you could go and contact, as well as then ways of obviously right up to obviously identifying health professionals who can help, as well as keeping the environment safe. So the key thing is what, with a safety plan, if you can identify the warning signs in advance, hopefully you can either escalate or you can avert a crisis escalating, or you can get the help and, or in terms of the help and support, keeping yourself safe. And I think that's what I've tried to do with the book. In terms, I see there's a question in the book about would you recommend the book to somebody who's still grieving? And I suppose it's written for, so my answer is yes, because when I was writing the book, what I've tried to do was write the book, although it's for a really general population or audience. I have three particular populations in mind, and those three populations I think the book will hopefully be helpful for are people who are bereaved by suicide, first and foremost, and such an important group of people. And the last chapter of the book is specifically talking about surviving obviously the devastation of suicide. But there's bits throughout the book which are important, I think, are helpful, I hope, for people who are bereaved. And then the other populations and people I particularly aimed the book at are people who've been previously suicidal, to help them hopefully understand why they felt suicidal, and then with a better understanding, I hope maybe that can be part of their ongoing recovery. And then the third group are people who are supporting people who are suicidal. And that could be mental health professionals, teachers, doctors, as well as family members, friends, and colleagues. So it's anybody, because we all will know somebody, either directly or indirectly at some stage in their lives, who's either been suicidal or lost somebody to suicide. So that's the sort of wide population of people I was aiming the book at. Thanks, Siobhan.
And I think it does that really well. And what's beautiful about the book is it gives you examples of real life situations where some of the themes of the model and of suicide, the suicide prevention themes, so that entrapment you've shown in the stories, how that can operate and what that looks like, and how people can be, and you know, that's an example of how people can be helped through that, and many stories there of survival and hope, which is really, really important running through the book as well. So the safety planning methods really come out of an understanding that suicidal behaviour is associated with mental illness, but treating the mental illness is not going to be the whole picture, that the suicidal thoughts need to be addressed themselves separately. Yeah. I think that's a really, really important message, that this is not, you know, if we're going to prevent suicide, it's not simply about treating mental illness. Do you want to talk a wee bit more about how safety planning methods should be used, and where are the treatments for mental illness? Where does that fit?
Well, so in Western countries, like obviously the United Kingdom, that suicide usually happens in the context of mental health problems, mental illness. But something I've been saying for many years in sort of talks that I give is that, so of course there is a relationship, and I never ever dispute we need to treat mental illness and mental health problems and the causes of mental illness and mental health problems. And treating the causes is both a social issue and an inequalities issue, as well as a biochemical issue. So definitely, because untreated or undertreated or wrongly treated mental illness is a risk factor, of course, for suicide. But what I often say is that, so although we know that mental illness is often associated with suicide in Western countries, and that's usually a mood disorder like depression, but the really stark statistic is that the overwhelming majority of people who've got treated for depression never die by suicide. It's about 4% will die by suicide. So that leads you then to think about, well, what do we need to look beyond mental illness? Because mental illness and mental health problems are important to treat, but we need to look beyond that. And I suppose what I often argue is that if we're to understand the complexity of suicide, we need to recognize that suicide is a behavior first and foremost. It's something that somebody does. And if you think about any other behavior that any of us do, it has many causes. And one of it, is the context, the background context could be in part depression. Of course it is. But I suppose I try to do with the model is say, well, actually, I argue that although there are biological, social, cultural, and clinical determinants of suicide risk, suicide is ultimately a psychological phenomenon, because an individual makes a decision to end their life because their pain is unbearable and they can't see it changing in the future. Now, when I say make a decision, it's not a decision, it's not a choice in that sense. It's because pain's so unbearable that their tunnel vision, this cognitive constriction, they can't see alternatives. And that's why I say if we're trying to prevent suicide, we need to look beyond mental illness, because it's not a strong predictor overall. And it's much more important is to understand, what is it leading to somebody to feel entrapped? What does it lead somebody to feel that mental pain that they're trying to escape from? And if you look at the evidence then for the sort of psychological treatments associated with suicide, the ones which have been most positive in terms of being more effective in reducing future suicidal behavior is those interventions which have treated the suicidal thoughts themselves, and that treating that mental pain as, in sort of the jargon we talk about, as being a central treatment target. And so that is really, really important, because if you look at, I talk about the collaborative assessment and management of suicidal, the CAMS approach to suicidality that Dave Jobs in the US has developed. And what Dave's whole argument is, he's trying to target in his treatment it's a framework which is trying to target the causes for somebody becoming suicidal effectively. And he gets people to think about sort of reasons for living and dying. And then he identifies also these sort of drivers for suicidal thoughts. And that's all recognized. We need to look beyond this mental health and mental illness perspective. Now, then, if you then bear in mind, in terms of treatment or support or helping people, so as I've said already, part of it is to tackle the things that lead somebody to becoming suicidal. And that's the sort of, in my model, that's the motivational or the pre-motivational phase, was the phase before that, which looks at trauma and inequalities and so on. But then there's a bit then about going, well, actually, how can we do more to keep people safe in terms of the volitional phase, so they don't cross that transition from thinking to acting on their thoughts. And so then that volitional phase may be things like, well, looking at restricting access to the lethal means of suicide. Because we do know that if somebody has formulated a particular plan of how they'd end their life, that usually if we can work with them collaboratively to restrict that access, then usually that does reduce, statistically speaking, reduces suicide risk. So it's trying, and that's part of what the safety plan does, but that's also the way big, large-scale public health interventions that governments and other agencies do, in terms of really trying to, how can we keep the environment safe in terms of areas of concern or high-risk areas where people may go or die by suicide. So there's lots we can do there. So I suppose the short message, I suppose, is if we're trying to look beyond mental illness, we have to also look at the pathway from the complex pathway to suicidal thoughts. And part of that is inequalities and disadvantage, and having access to substance misuse services, providing care and support early in life, because we know that early life adversity is associated with a marked increased risk of mental and physical health in terms of poor outcomes, as well as suicidal behavior. So we need to do as much as we can early in life to sort of ameliorate that risk and sort of develop resilience and so on.
So, and absolutely, Rory, and that's why the things that we're taking forward in the mental health strategy in Northern Ireland around early intervention and prevention they're relevant to suicide prevention, and as relevant, arguably, as the services that desperately need to be improved. And Anne has commented on this in the Q&A. Absolutely, we recognise that our services haven't been meeting the needs of everybody. Now, there are some excellent services in Northern Ireland, and people who phone Lifeline always report a really good experience. So, you know, if you're feeling suicidal, you shouldn't let the negative conversations about mental health service stop you from asking for help, because many people do have really good experiences with services and move through those suicidal thoughts and have access to those sorts of treatments in Northern Ireland right now. So if you're distressed, call Lifeline on 0808 808 8000. Can I ask you, Rory, just to go into a wee bit more detail on two things after you've said what you're going to say there? Sorry.
No, but you just reminded me again something else, Siobhan, which is, so absolutely, I agree entirely that there's still no parity of esteem between mental health services and physical health services. And we know that in access to child and adolescent mental health services in all parts of the UK is under strain. And so we need to do more about that. But having said all that, we need to recognise that less than 30% of people who die by suicide are in contact with mental health services in the year before they die. So that really highlights, if we're to prevent suicide, mental health services, of course, is part of it, but we need to look, and that's why the public health approach is so important. Now, we have to also understand why it's less than 30% of people who contact with mental health services. Now, that could be that the services are not tailored to support the needs of people who are most vulnerable. And that could be that the individual who's suicidal doesn't think that the services will work, or that they think that they don't need the services. There's a lot, or more than that. That's just three possibilities. So I think there's something we need to do about that, is that suicide prevention is more than mental health provision, mental health services provision. But sorry, Siobhan, you were about to then ask me a couple of things there, sorry.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about impulsivity, and it is linked to a question from one of our anonymous attendees saying that, you know, is healthcare currently placed to provide care without a diagnosis? And so well, it's not actually, it's not quite so relevant to that question, but I'm thinking about this whole idea of impulsivity and people, yeah, it's the other one, people who are moving from thoughts to action and act very quickly. You know, talk to us about that and stress reactivity and biological factors that come into play there.
Well, so then maybe it might be useful to say a bit before about the volitional phase. So the volitional phase is from thoughts to acts. And according to my model, we've identified 8 factors, which the presence of those 8 factors increase the likelihood that somebody will act on their thoughts of suicide. And they include things like having access to the means of suicide. So if somebody is feeling suicidal and have access to the means, they're more likely to act on their thoughts. What we call exposure to suicide, so knowing somebody else who's died by suicide or attempted suicide, increases our risk statistically. Now, it's really important to highlight, though, that that's a statistical increase. The overwhelming majority of people who know somebody who's died by suicide will never become suicidal and will never die by suicide, but still an important risk factor to identify. And then one of the others is impulsivity, as you say, Siobhan. Now, I think the relationship between impulsivity and suicide is very, very complicated. And I think it changes across the lifespan. So there's some evidence which suggests that levels of impulsivity increase from puberty through to your mid-20s. And that might be part of the explanation why we know that the experience of mental health problems or self-harm or suicidal behavior is almost non-existent statistically in terms of frequency before puberty, and then it starts to increase. And the largest period of increase is during adolescence. You see this really stark increase in all forms of self-injurious behavior and also the onset of mental health problems. And that's partly maybe linked to the brain development, because your brain is still developing, we think now right up to your mid-20s. And the reason we think it's such a dangerous period, adolescence, in that sense, is because there's a mismatch between your sort of emotional development and what we describe as your cognitive development, part of your sort of decision-making, planning, and so on. And part of that might be also linked to impulsivity, and that's why your impulsivity is more common. And so you've got this situation with this mismatch between emotional, you're really trying to, a young person is really trying to struggle with these difficult emotions, thinking they're different from somebody else and can't make sense of it, and maybe can feel very alone and really super sensitive to rejection at that age. Add to that the sense of impulsivity, you're more likely to act on your thoughts. Now, but if you look at the research evidence in terms of statistical terms, it's probably the relationship is still quite modest. It's only one of a many number of factors that would need to be present. So if somebody is more likely to be impulsive, lots of other things need to be there. I often talk about this perfect storm of factors needs to be present before somebody will become suicidal or act on their thoughts of suicide. And then obviously, so we've done work on in terms of other biological factors. Obviously, impulsivity, there's some sort of biological basis. And also talk about the stress system. So one of the things that I've done a lot of work with, I have a twin brother, some people may know, that who's also a psychologist, and he's a stress researcher. And we've done some work on the sort of stress system, because one of the things we know is that when any one of us encounters stressful situations, we need our body to respond with cortisol, which is one of the stress hormones. And when cortisol is released, it's like this stress, the fight or flight response. It prepares the body either to fight the challenge or the danger or flee the situation. And we've done some of our work which has shown then that fight or flight response, that levels of cortisol, that in people who previously attempted suicide, it's what was called a blunted cortisol response, which means that people who have a history of suicide attempts are releasing less cortisol. So if their body's releasing less cortisol, which we think may also be associated with emotion regulation, problem solving, decision making, three things which are integral to thinking about somebody acting on their thoughts of suicide. So if you have a situation in which your psychophysiology in the case of cortisol, if that's dysregulated or low levels, that means that the next time somebody who's had a history of suicide attempts, for example, encounters another stressor, well, their body's maybe not as prepared to actually effectively respond to that challenge or those stressors. Now, if you add into the mix then that sort of physiological difficulty with the cortisol system to the sense of this unbearable mental pain, and that mental pain is exhausting. And so that mental pain that people often talk about, the system just is like run down. It's like it becomes dysregulated. So you can start to see how this perfect storm of factors come together, both in biology and psychology, but often maybe driven by what's happened in your past. Because we've also shown in a study that the amount of cortisol that people release in some of our laboratory studies is associated with how much trauma people tell us they've received or they've experienced early in life. And what we think happens in trauma experience early in life for some, it can change the way genes are expressed if it happens at a critical period early in life, and that's called this sort of epigenetics. And this idea that some parts of your genetic profiling or genetic expression changes, that maybe increases your vulnerability. Now, none of this is about an inevitability. So it's not a case that if somebody has been previously experienced trauma, that they're inevitably going to become suicidal. That's certainly not the case. But what we're trying to demonstrate is if you're trying to understand suicide risk, you need to take this lifespan approach and identify if somebody is vulnerable in terms of the cortisol system, for example, being adversely affected by early life trauma, or for trauma at any stage in your life. Well, we need to then recognize that's a vulnerability. And similarly, if we're sticking for a second to early life trauma, we know that early life trauma can affect the attachment relationships, like how so remember when we learn how to relate with others, how to trust others, how to reciprocate, how to engage in everyday life and relationships early on in life. Now, if they're disrupted in childhood, of course, then that's a vulnerability factor, because how we learn to interact in adulthood is obviously influenced by what happened in our childhood. Now, again, it's not an inevitability, it's a vulnerability, but we can then help somebody identify that vulnerability and hopefully get the help and support that they require.
And this is so beautiful, Rory, because it fits with what I talk about in terms of transgenerational trauma. You know, the idea of how a parent who's traumatized, whose stress response is perhaps affected by what they've gone through, and even their ability to connect and form those attachments with their children. And that's primarily the mechanism. There may well be a biological mechanism there too that can impact on this, but that's why transgenerational trauma is related to suicide. And that's also maybe something that's happening in Northern Ireland. And we know that we have more people here who've experienced significant trauma exposure.
Yeah.
So,
and just something else I just saw in the chat there, Siobhan. So somebody's asked about some of the phases. So just a note on the pre-motivational phase. So the pre-motivational phase doesn't directly, I would argue, it's not that you're in the pre-motivational phase and then you go into the motivational and then the volitional. The pre-motivational phase I will often describe as the background context in which suicidal risk may emerge. So in a sense, your early life trauma is part of the motivational phase. What we bring to life in terms of our personalities, that's part of the motivational phase, or the pre-motivational phase, and our environmental influences are part of the pre-motivational phase. Well, crucially though, they influence the likelihood that you feel defeated. They increase the likelihood that you go then from the feeling defeat leads to a sense of entrapment, and so that's where that fits in, just to be clear.
And it's so important because we need to be talking about things like poverty and reducing inequalities. And these are factors that affect that pre-motivational phase. So they are suicide prevention issues. Even though they're universal interventions, I think often the conversation focuses around what should happen when someone's in a crisis. Someone has asked the question about how can we reduce that mental pain when people are in a crisis. Do you want to talk to us about what crisis intervention services should look like, and what are the key constructs of crisis intervention, the key components there, Rory? Because I know you were involved in designing one in Scotland that was it's really, really impressive work as well.
Well, there's different ways I would answer that. So yeah, one is obviously how one works with somebody in crisis to reduce the mental pain, but there's also the bit which is what we, when I say we, I mean government, communities, individuals can do to increase the likelihood that somebody feels valued and feels less likely to feel defeated or humiliated, all that stuff. So there's two bits. I'll answer that. On the bit on the crisis, I think so. Certainly, what we're trying to do now with my model is use it as a framework, and clinicians are using it as a framework now for formulation to identify what are the factors, for example, that contribute to somebody feeling trapped. So if you're trying to alleviate somebody's mental pain, it's what are the drivers to that mental pain? And so if we can identify the factors that lead somebody to feel trapped, then we can then they can be targeted in treatment. So I would use the model as a framework to understand the sort of, in a sense, it's like doing a clinical history, but it's a slightly different way of doing the clinical history. Because I would argue that the pre-motivational, the first phase is really a standard clinical history. And then you're really looking at the motivational and volitional phase in terms of understanding what is it that leads you to feel suicidal. But crucially, it helps, because often people who are suicidal maybe have difficulty to understand why they feel the way they do, or even if they do, it's difficult to have some sort of framework to understand the sort of transition of thoughts and feelings. And I suppose then clinically, I would argue that the model can form a framework to do that. So that would be one way of the clinician working. Then if I would like to say something about the more broader issue, these wider community stuff. So in Scotland, I do work with the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group, one of the members of that, in our strategy and action plan. And one of the things that the model is now used as a framework to help us to think about what strategies or what actions will be most effective in hopefully our aspiration of reducing suicide, obviously. But what the question we're starting to ask is, at the level of clinical services, is it clinical services promoting a sense of entrapment, or is it reducing a sense of entrapment? And that could be, if we think about people we know who go to the emergency departments and they feel that they haven't been treated with compassion or respect or a sense of humanity, that will only serve to add to their sense of entrapment, add to their sense of mental pain. So in every part of our sort of action plan, what we're trying to do now is think about, and that's a level of clinical services, similarly at the level of policy more broadly, our policies promoting inclusion, promoting a sense of compassion, or promoting a sense of self-worth. So it reduces the likelihood that somebody feels defeated, humiliated, trapped, and so on. And I think even just asking at a policy level, at a community level, and at an individual level, if we can start addressing that question, saying, actually, in the same way we now have to do a sort of inequalities assessment for every policy, we should be doing the same with regard to, is that policy going to increase mental pain or self-worth or entrapment or defeat and humiliation on an individual, or reduce it? And if it's going to increase it, it should be abandoned or should be tailored and modified.
Yeah, and this is again so important. It aligns with what we would describe maybe as trauma-informed practice, where you're empowering individuals. And for me, the idea of being trapped is exactly the opposite of hope. You know, you can get people to stay in that pain for that moment and help work through the issues that have caused that pain, but they need the hope that it's going to end, you know, and it's about giving people hope. And I think the compassion, the connections that we have with each other are so important as well. So for me, the staff who are delivering services, they also need to be looked after in a particular way so that they're in a position to do that. And that's why that whole system approach is so absolutely vital. So one of the things I wanted to cover, and I realize we're getting close to the end, but I think there's some very good checklists in this, just easy things that you can take and pin in the wall if you're a clinician. And one of them is around the signs that someone might be suicidal, the warning signs. Now, I know these are not kind of perfect predictors, but you want to just go through them, Rory, so just to remind us of what are the things that we might want to be looking for.
Well, so, and I cover this in the book, and and it's with this proviso that our ability to predict suicide is no better than chance. So it's really important to say that. But what we can still do, though, is have a better antennae to maybe what warning signs might be. So that's things like, there should be, in some senses, there's no surprises, but it's people obviously talking about feeling a burden on others, talking about being trapped or being hopeless. Changes in behavior is another important one. Again, obviously in eating, sleeping, drinking, sexual activity, those sort of changes would maybe illustrate something might be going on, but something is different and somebody may be struggling. And that, I suppose, the highlights a really important one, which is sleep. Because one of the things which has probably been under researched until maybe the last 10 years or so in the suicide field is anything that interrupts our sleep increases our risk, because we need sleep to regulate our emotions, to problem solve, to basically help us navigate everyday life. So anything of which we can do to promote sleep is really, really important. But then obviously the one which is a myth, but it's an important one, which relates to sort of warning signs, is that if somebody has been feeling down and has been really, really struggling, and then for no apparent reason, they seem to be fine. And that would ring alarm bells for me, because what we think might be going on, because if somebody's in the depths of a depressive episode or some crisis in their life, and they can think of no solution to that crisis, because remember, suicide is the ultimate. Edmund Schneidman, who's like one of the founding fathers of suicide research and prevention, talks about suicide being a permanent solution to often temporary problems. And the concern we have in terms of somebody's mood seems to have been elevated or got better for no apparent reason, the concern is in the depths of their pain, they've decided upon the solution to their pain, which is to end their life. And once the individual has decided on suicide as a solution, our concern is their mood may have lifted because they found the way they can end their pain. And then the other thing is that as somebody's leaving their sort of emerging from the depth of a depressive episode, is then they might have the motivation to be able to plan the suicide attempt and act on their thoughts. So for me, that will be an important one to look out for. Now, of course, if somebody is depressed or whatever in a real crisis, and the crisis has been solved, or the person receives support or treatment or whatever it is, and that's working, of course, that can explain it. The point, I suppose, is it's this unexplained increase. I think the important one. So yeah, the other thing, I suppose, is just this, suppose, is more for clinicians, I suppose, is with obviously going for just checklist approaches to suicide risk there's no evidence they work at all. And indeed, in the NICE clinical guidance, which is the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, we do not, for the management of self-harm, we do not recommend the use of checklists on their own. Checklists can be useful as part of understanding somebody's story, but they certainly should not be used to decide care and treatment or risk.
Okay, really, really important point again, because often I've been asked about why aren't they using suicide risk assessments and things like that. But again, why your book's so important, because people can read through and develop a more nuanced understanding of this behaviour, and that's actually one of the benefits of the book. So can we talk a wee bit for a minute about self-harm? So somebody has asked that question about people self-harm in order to reduce their pain, in order to stay alive, in order to cope with pain, but it works for them temporarily, and it also increased the risk of suicide. So that appears to be a bit of a contradiction. So talk us through the roles of self-harm and the mechanisms involved there.
Yeah, so absolutely, and I talk about this in the book as well, which is, so we know that anybody who self-harms, their statistical risk is increased. The likelihood that they'll self-harm or attempt suicide or die by suicide is increased in the future. Again, it's a statistical increase. Most people who self-harm will self-harm for a period of time, or in one episode even, and then we'll never do it again. So that's really important to highlight first. But exactly as I can't see that question, whoever was asked made that comment, is absolutely, for many people, self-harm is not about wanting to die. Because the way we define self-harm, it's any form of self-injurious behavior, which without intervention could have ended in death. And so it includes what some people describe as non-suicidal self-injury, as well as a suicide attempt. Now, but yeah, exactly. So for often, and not often, but sometimes certainly young people to report that it's a way of actually staying alive, of regulating their emotions. But the concern is that over time, often, self-harm can then, with no suicidal intent, can escalate into having suicidal intent. Now, we don't quite understand that relationship, but part of it may be that if one uses self-harm as a strategy to manage one's emotions at one time, and then over time, that's something that somebody will return to, but perhaps that needs to escalate or change to get the same release, and which people often talk about. But then the concern is that then if you're not getting the same release, or it's not helping you manage your pain, that could then contribute to your sense of being trapped. And then over time, you can see how that starts to escalate. Because the other thing to note is that even though people who tell us they self-harm, and they're not, and that self-harm wasn't about wanting to die, they're often also at the same time having suicidal thoughts. So it's a really complicated field. And I suppose my message is that what we need to do is recognize that self-harm or any form of self-injurious behavior has never got one cause. It very rarely has one cause. It's always multiple reasons and factors. And what you're trying to do then is to understand what drives an individual to feel that way, and then hopefully tackle the causes, or think of different ways in which somebody can respond to manage their pain they're experiencing.
Okay, very useful there, because self-harm is very common actually in young people, and very distressing, I think, for parents and teachers, you know, when they see it. But it's important to understand what it's about.
And then the other thing, sorry, Siobhan, coming ahead, there's in the section and later on in the book, I mean, I talk about this, about the challenges, obviously, for parents or caregivers supporting somebody who's suicidal or who's self-harming. And so I hope that there's some good, useful guidance in there and tips. But it's also worth noting that self-harm, although you're right, obviously, as you've said, Siobhan, it's rare. Well, it's rare before puberty, and then it's very, relatively speaking, common. At least 1 in 10 young people will self-harm by the age of 16. Self-harm still occurs obviously later in life as well. And when people who struggle with self-harm later in life often get really frustrated that it's seen as this, it's often characterized as this adolescent thing, and it's not. So it's really important, sorry, just to make that point.
Yeah, and somebody else has put in a question about older people and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Are, you know, suicidal thoughts are common across the lifespan.
Absolutely.
Because young people are less likely to die generally, it accounts for a higher proportion of deaths, and therefore gets maybe more attention when it's in that age group. Really good. So we've only a couple of minutes left now, and I wanted just to end, Rory, with some key messages that you would put out there, reflecting on some of the comments. People are asking for tips of what to do, what we can all do. There are rarely warning signs. Actually, Eva has made the point that sometimes there aren't any warning signs. So it's very difficult to know how we as individuals can help reduce suicide generally, and how we, what our role is. And yet we know every one of us does have a role here. So what would you say to us generally, Rory, about our role in all of this, just as members of the public?
Well, in Scotland, we have a strapline for our national suicide prevention strategy, the last one, which was suicide prevention is everyone's business. And I suppose the reason we say that is because all of us can play a role, and no matter how small we play in preventing suicide. And so, for example, recently on Pat Kenny on Irish radio, whatever, a couple of weeks ago, there's a lady who I gave a talk as a transparent in Belfast 10 years ago or more, must be more than 10 years ago. And something I said in the talk really stayed with her, and she came up to me at the end of the talk. I don't remember this. And then she emailed me when she was really struggling, and I responded, and she said, please hold on, please stay alive, suicidal thoughts aren't permanent, or something. And she was on Pat Kenny, whatever, the Irish radio show, whatever, 2 weeks ago, saying that when that acute moment, when she's been acutely suicidal, she remembers that, and the fact that I'd responded. Now, this is not about me, this is about highlighting that we never know what we can do that makes a difference. Small things can make a big difference. And again, I talk about a guy in the book who who was acutely suicidal and was left his flat to just think about what he was going to do. And he just happened to bang into a girl who he often saw on his commute to work. And she smiled at him, and then she noticed that there was something not right with him, or that he was obviously preoccupied, and she was concerned. And she just asked him, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And he said that was enough just to interrupt for that moment when he was acutely suicidal. That helped him. And also he felt valued, that somebody had noticed that he wasn't feeling great, or he was struggling. I suppose in terms of a message of hope, or something we all can do, is we all can reach out and ask somebody, a friend, a family member, a stranger, are they doing okay? And indeed, Samaritans did a great campaign a few years ago about, obviously, that small talk can save lives. And I suppose it's just remembering that just reaching out, that sense of connection with another human being, could be enough to start somebody on a journey of recovery. So I'm not saying it's about that, and so I'm not trying to reduce the complexity. Suicide prevention is at all levels. So that would be, I suppose, that would be my message of hope. Please, if you are concerned about somebody, please reach out for help. If you've reached out for help and you haven't found the help which has worked for you yet, please try again. Please try again. And again, I talk about people I've met over the years who have tried and thought nobody could ever save them, and that their pain will never end. But they were able to keep going and hold on to life. And they're now looking back through those periods of crisis, which they thought would never end, and through those periods which they thought they would never get help or support, which would end their pain, and they did. So please, if you're struggling, please hold on. If you're any one of us, please reach out to a loved one if you're concerned.
Yeah, and that's such an important point. This could be any one of us. Anyone can feel suicidal, and those compassionate connections, helping people get support, just showing that you care, can really make all the difference to someone in that moment. So thank you for that. I put up our helpline numbers again. Lifeline 0808 808 8000. Samaritans are on 116 123. And Rory, you wanted to make another point.
Sorry, Siobhan. The other one is, you talked about compassion, obviously, but self-compassion is so important. And we think about, so we all struggle in life and go through the challenges, everyday challenges, or not so everyday challenges. But the point is that we're often so super critical of ourselves, and that super critical of ourselves leads us, that contributes to that mental pain. So one of the things I talk about in the book is the importance of us being compassionate to ourselves, and that nobody is perfect, and we all have failings, and we all will fail and struggle, but it's through that struggle hopefully we can grow as individuals. So please try to be self-compassionate, as well as obviously showing compassion to others.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be kind, and we need to look after ourselves so that we can notice the signs in other people, so that we can help other people. And there's so much we haven't talked about, like social perfectionism is part of that as well. And there's different types of perfectionism. And I'm really grateful, Rory, for the fact that in this book you open up a bit about your own struggles and how you're looking after your mental health and well-being. And I think that's really important. You know, because you're a role model as well. So thank you for that. And so I think that's everything. We've covered it. We've covered a lot of ground there. Of course, there's so much more in this book, and I really would urge you to get it and get hold of it and read it. It's good for people who have been bereaved as well. I think there was a question there. I think it is nice for someone who's been bereaved by suicide to hear the stories and to understand a bit more about that. And also there's a lot of stuff that will benefit people who are working in this area clinically, and people who are just interested in looking after themselves and looking after the people around them. There's just some wonderful stuff there, and it's a very easy read. So thank you so much, Rory.
Well, thanks, Siobhan, and thanks, Vic, for the opportunity. And yeah, and hopefully people find it helpful, and hopefully people find the book helpful, because obviously it was I took a risk writing the book the way I did, and I was really quite anxious before it was published how it would be received, but it's been really rewarding how warmly it's been received. And so hopefully it will help either people struggling or people who are bereaved by suicide.
And it's really your voice as well. So I just have to throw this in, because when I was reading it in my own head, I heard you say it. So it is actually, it's really the way that you talk about this stuff. It's very digestible, and you're from Northern Ireland. So it was a really good read for people from Northern Ireland. in that sense, if you know what I mean too. But let's leave it there. Thanks so much, Rory.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Cheers. Good night.